20 to 35% high intensity. So naturally, even in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests of the Sierra Nevada, for example, and elsewhere in the West, even in these forest types, the fires were dominated by low and moderate intensity, but there was a significant component of high intensity fire. And it's natural that 20 to 35% is pretty common. Sometimes it was lower, sometimes a little higher. And interestingly, another thing that there's a lot of misinformation about is historical forest density. Not only were the forests variable in terms of the fire intensity, which is great because different wildlife species need different things. Some like it hot, some like the surface fire where the trees are mostly live and green. Different species need different things. But the forests were also highly variable in terms of their density. There were forests that were very dense and forests that were open in any given forest type at any given time. The one thing that's really interesting is that historical forests were much denser than was previously reported. There was a series of U.S. Forest Service studies that were published over a decade ago, mostly, or around a decade ago. And they reported that the forests of the Sierra Nevada historically were relatively low density. And therefore, they said we need to do a bunch of logging to restore the forests. Well, my colleagues and I got curious about this, and we went to the National Archives, and we spent many long hours and days and months researching those very important original historical documents from over a century ago, from these early forest surveys. And what we found is that they left most of the trees out, the Forest Service folks, and they left out the oaks, they left out the small trees, they left out other trees that were not, timber trees. When you included all of those, it turns out the historical forests were 7 times denser than they reported in mixed conifer forests in terms of trees per acre. And in ponderosa pine forests, they were 17 times denser. So it gives you a very different idea of what those historical forests were. And also, it should make people skeptical about current management practices when they're killing and removing 70 or 80% of the trees in a given stand, including many mature and old growth trees, and they're calling it thinning and restoration. Be very skeptical of that. So more corroboration of this, in the late 1800s, a team from the U.S. Geological Survey spent years, about 8 years, surveying the entire northern Sierra Nevada forests. And you can see these those white polygons in there that have the cross-hatching. Those are large high-intensity fire patches that they mapped that occurred at some point during the 1800s, before fire suppression, before logging. These were areas that had not been logged. And so you can see that some of these patches were very large. If you look at the scale on the bottom, you can see what 10 kilometers is. Some of them are, 10, 15 kilometers across. So these are big patches. And it's not to say that they happened all the time. Obviously, they didn't. But over the course of any given century, you're going to have a number of those patches across the landscape. And this is what that looks like on the ground, up close and personal. I took this picture at 12 years post-fire. This is a patch of what we call complex early seral forest. We also call it snag forest habitat. And this is the unique forest habitat type that is created by patches of high intensity fire. Sometimes they're small patches, just a couple acres in size or so. Sometimes they're medium-sized patches. Sometimes they're big patches, hundreds of acres in size, even thousands of acres in size in certain cases or more. And it turns out that we now have literally hundreds of scientific studies about the unique biodiversity in these forest type that wasn't even considered to be a forest type before. And it turns out that snag forest habitat is actually comparable to old growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. And it's because of that rich habitat complexity. A snag forest habitat is nothing like a clear cut. You have the standing dead trees, which are called snags. You have the down logs. You have the native flowering shrubs that grow in after fire and are stimulated by fire. You have the wildflowers. You have the naturally regenerating conifers and oaks and dogwoods. And you have this rich, complex system, and different groups of wildlife species depend on each of those components. Well, one of those that I like to highlight is the black-backed woodpecker, and that's the bird at the top there by that nest cavity. I've been researching the black-backed woodpecker in the field for about 2 decades now. And the black-backed woodpecker has evolved to depend specifically on interior areas of large fires. They'll inhabit smaller fires too if the habitat's good. But what they really need are larger patches of high-intensity fire that occurs in pretty dense mature forests, where you've got a lot of medium and large trees, and fire kills most or all of them. That's their habitat. But why is that? Well, there's two key things the black-backed woodpecker needs. Black-backed woodpecker needs fire-killed trees because they're softer than live trees, and they can excavate those nest cavities like you see there. They also need fire-killed trees because recently fire-killed trees are the different groups of native beetles called wood-boring beetles depend on recently fire-killed trees in order to reproduce. So these are beetles that are native in these forests. They've been here for countless millennia, just like the black-backed woodpecker, and they make a beeline for these fires as the fires are occurring. They'll show up right after the flames have passed, and as the smoke is starting to clear and the trees are cooling down, they will lay their eggs on the charred bark of a fire-killed tree, and their larvae develop, and they bore through the bark into the wood of the tree, and they develop there over the course of time into adults, and then they later emerge sometime later. Black-backed woodpeckers depend on those larvae that in turn depend on fire-killed trees. Well, one black-backed woodpecker eats thousands and thousands of these beetle larvae every single year. And there are a number of other woodpecker species that have evolved similar dependencies on snag forest habitat and on these beetle larvae. And all of them excavate multiple nest cavities every single year. And they choose the one they like the best every spring. Well, so all the other ones that they create every year that they don't choose are available for all the other cavity nesting species in the forest that also need tree cavities to raise their young and to reproduce, but they can't create their own. Bluebirds, nuthatches, flying squirrels, chipmunks, countless bird and small mammal species need these cavities. They depend on the woodpeckers to create the cavities. The woodpeckers depend on the beetle larvae, and the beetle larvae and the woodpeckers depend on fire to create patches of fire-killed trees. So we have this rich interconnected habitat type. And that also includes, of course, all the understory plants, these flowering plants like shrubs and wildflowers that grow in and are stimulated by intense fire in particular. And that attracts flying insects, that attracts fly-catching birds and bats that feed on those flying insects. And it also attracts small mammals that live in those shrubs and the down logs. So you really have an incredible biodiversity in these snag forests. And in fact, as fire intensity goes up, so too does overall bird abundance in many different studies. And we find that this is actually a really important habitat type. And that's not to say that mature forests that burn at low intensity aren't important too. They are. They're incredibly important for lots of other species. But there's a unique group of species that depends on snag forest habitat. So we know that has to be part of the mix. Now, one of the other big questions that comes up is, well, what about natural regeneration? If the trees are all killed, how can the forest possibly regenerate? Well, this has been a big misunderstanding for a long time. And for so many decades, the Forest Service and private logging companies just cut down the forest right after a fire. And we never got a chance to see what the forest would do in the absence of that kind of logging. Well, that's begun to change over the last 20 years as there's been more scientific understanding and more conservation groups willing to go to court to stand up for the science and the new science and allow these natural processes to occur. And what we've discovered is that these forests regenerate extremely well after fire. This is me and Dr. James Hanson, a famed climate scientist, in the Rim Fire in a large high-intensity fire patch. This is at 8 years post-fire. And here, of course, you see the natural regeneration is well over the tops of our heads. This is one of the many areas where the Forest Service said that it will not regenerate because it burned at high intensity and it's not immediately adjacent to live trees. And what we found is that this is the rule, not the exception. These areas are overwhelmingly regenerating. However, this is right next door, the same high intensity fire patch, but this part had been subjected to post-fire logging, herbicide spraying, and artificial planting years earlier. And about 4 or 5 years earlier, that's when that happened. And this is what it still looks like today. You can see, if you look closely, you can see a few of the seedlings that they planted are still growing and living, but most of them died. And you really just have a stump field and some slash debris and a lot of invasive grasses for the most part. And so this is what post-fire logging gives you, and post-fire logging and planting, even though it's being done under the guise of restoration and reforestation. In truth, in practice, it is anything but that, and it's quite the opposite. Now, the question comes up, well, but what about high-intensity fire patches in particular, and especially those interior areas of those large high-intensity fire patches? If you have a big high-intensity fire patch that's several hundred acres in size, maybe a few thousand acres in size, maybe even bigger than that, what about those areas that are more than 150 meters away from the nearest live tree, more than 300 meters away? How can they possibly regenerate, or are they going to be good for any wildlife species? Well, there's some research that's addressing those questions too, and the answers are really interesting. So it turns out that interior areas of large high-intensity fire patches, and in this case, we're talking about over 400 hectares, which is about 1,000 acres or larger, and the interior areas that are more than 100 meters inside those patches, and also more than 300 meters away from the nearest live trees, those interior areas of big high-intensity fire patches, they only comprise 0.6% and 0.13% of the ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests across the western United States. So even though there's a very high proportion of the studies and the management practices that are ostensibly trying to investigate this question and trying to prevent large high-intensity fire patches, U.S. Forest Service management practices in particular, the reality is these areas are only a small fraction of 1% of these forest types across the West. And that needs to be understood for context. Now, interestingly, a recent study came out and the authors completely missed the significance of their own findings. But it turns out they looked at the interior areas of large high-intensity fire patches and in terms of bird species. And in terms of their selection and avoidance of habitat. And 13% of the Sierra Nevada bird species are actually preferentially selecting not just high-intensity fire patches, but interior areas of large high-intensity fire patches. So even though those areas only comprise less than a fraction of 1% of the forest, 13% of the bird species are selecting them. That tells you that these areas are very important ecologically because bird species are disproportionately selecting them more than you would expect based upon their availability. Now, not all bird species. Again, some like the low severity areas where you have mostly live trees, but a significant percentage are really going out of their way to select these interior areas of large high intensity fire patches. And my colleague Tanya Chi and I did a very extensive, intensive study in the rimfire of these large high intensity fire patches. And we found that even more than 300 meters, more than 1,000 feet into the interior of these patches, more than 1,000 feet away from the nearest live surviving tree, the forests were naturally regenerating just wonderfully. We found an average of 256 naturally regenerating conifer seedlings and saplings per hectare. That's more than 100 per acre, more than 1,000 feet from the nearest live surviving tree. And this was only at 5 years post-fire. There's even more regeneration since then. And this is a picture of one of those areas. This is deep in the interior of the second largest high-intensity fire patch in the rimfire. And I took this picture at 8 years post-fire. Just for perspective, a lot of these conifer seedlings and saplings at that time were already 12 feet tall. Some were 9 feet, some were 6 feet, but the tallest ones were already 12 feet tall. And this is the same large high-intensity fire patch. This is immediately adjacent, and this area was post-fire logged and planted several years earlier. And again, just like the other area, you can see that it's basically just a stump field with some invasive grasses that are brought in by the logging machinery and spread by the post-fire logging. And most of what they planted died. Now, in some areas, you will see more of the trees they plant survive, but this is really common for there to be very, very widespread mortality and failure of their efforts to plant after, because they just do so much soil damage with the post-fire logging, and they kill almost all the natural regeneration, which is adapted uniquely to that particular microsite. This is also 8 years post-fire in a large high-intensity fire patch in the rim fire. This is my colleague, Doug Bevington, standing there, so you can see, get a sense of how tall these trees are already at that short period of time post-fire. And, interestingly, I've got a study in peer review right now on giant sequoias and high-intensity fire. And no one had ever looked at what giant sequoias do in terms of reproduction in large high-intensity fire patches. Because we really just didn't have much potential to research that, because we've been pretty successfully keeping fire out of sequoia growth since the late 1800s until recently, the last 10, 12 years. But now what we're seeing is that a very small percentage of these areas are experiencing high intensity fire with large patches, but that's where we're finding some of the very best natural sequoia regeneration. And what you see in the middle of the picture there, and also in the foreground, are all sequoia saplings. These are about 4 or 5 feet tall. I took this picture 4 years post-fire, I believe. And, this is an area that burned at high intensity, and it's not adjacent to any live surviving trees. And yet, this grove had been slowly dying off for the better part of a century due to the lack of fire. And now there are hundreds of times more giant sequoias vigorously growing, and just hundreds per acre. These are more giant sequoias in this high intensity fire patch. We really haven't seen giant sequoia reproduction like this for over a century. These groves, this is just something you don't see. Giant sequoias need fire to reproduce effectively, not just fire, but higher intensity fire in particular. And what I found is in the low intensity fire areas, which again is great for a lot of species, but not so much for giant sequoias. Low intensity fire areas, most of these areas have no regeneration of sequoias whatsoever. It's just like it was before the fire, a massive failure of reproduction that's been going on for the better part of a century. And so that's really important to keep in mind. We can talk more about that in Q&A if people are interested. I'm going to send cover a couple of additional things before we go to Q&A, but this one is really important. I mentioned a moment ago about the work that Tanya Chi and I did in the rim fire, finding lots of regeneration of conifers in the interior of these large high-intensity fire patches. Well, we found that the main reason that a lot of previous studies, Forest Service studies, had reported the opposite is that they're reporting a particular metric. They're reporting the percentage of their field plots that have natural post-fire conifer regeneration versus the percentage that do not. And what we found is that their field plots are far, far too small. And that the size of the field plots has a profound effect on the proportion of plots that you report that have conifer regeneration. And so if you have tiny, tiny field plots, you're going to end up with a bunch of zeros in your field plots. And if you make them really, really small, most of your field plots will have zeros, even in places that have 300-400 conifer seedlings or saplings per acre. And so it gives you a false impression of what's going on, because what they've been doing is, on that basis, they've been reporting that 50% or so of the high intensity fire areas have been type converted to non-forest. And what we found in those very same areas is that they actually have 100, 200, sometimes more conifer seedlings and saplings per acre. You just have to use a plot size that's decent and adequate. And we found 20-meter radius was about what you need, really, to understand what's happening in these forests. And more recent study from a number of Forest Service authors, Steele et al. 2022, and I know that my colleague and friend Brian Baker talked to you about this, so I'll just be brief on this point. They recently claimed that 30% of conifer forests of the southern Sierra Nevada have been converted to non-forest over the past decade by fire and bark beetles. And the question is that really true? Turns out, no, it's not even remotely true. Two major problems with that. Number one is that most of the areas they categorized as being converted to non-forest look like this. They're actually have relatively low tree mortality, certainly some trees killed by fire or beetles, but mostly live trees. And you simply have a more heterogeneous forest. It's got some ecologically valuable snags that it didn't have before, and lots of live tree canopy cover. And so that's what it mostly looks like. And then, of course, the areas that really did burn at high intensity have not been converted to non-forest. They're regenerating wonderfully, as we just talked about. So One last thing I'll cover here quickly is this issue of carbon sink or source. It turns out that the research is very clear that our forests are still carbon sinks. They're pretty significant carbon sinks, even with recent fires. And they could be even bigger carbon sinks, however, if we weren't logging these forests, if we protected far more of our forests from logging so that we weren't removing carbon from them, because most of the carbon we remove in these logging operations goes up into the atmosphere almost immediately. And very little ends up stored in a home somewhere or in a building, commercial or otherwise. And biomass logging is even worse because everything that's removed there goes into the atmosphere essentially immediately. Whole trees, branches, everything is chipped and brought down to these biomass facilities and burned on site for energy. We call this clear cuts for kilowatts. And this is what it looks like. This is happening on public lands with taxpayer dollars by the U.S. Forest Service, contracting, basically selling these trees to logging companies that are clear cutting them for energy production, burning the trees like giant sticks of coal. And burning trees for energy emits even more CO2 than burning coal for equal energy produced. It's actually even worse than coal as an energy source in terms of being a dirty fuel. So what does it all mean? The bottom line is, beware of legislation claiming to promote forest health, fuel reduction, or restoration. These are typically almost entirely buzzwords, euphemisms for logging, for commercial logging, including clear cutting and removal of mature and old growth trees on our public lands. Thinning as well is another big euphemism. And support any proposed legislation or rulemaking that would protect public forests, either wholly or in part by ending logging or logging subsidies, and also acquisition of private forest lands into protected status. That's where we need to go so we can draw down more of that excess CO2 in our atmosphere instead of putting a lot more CO2 into the atmosphere through logging operations. All right, so I will stop screen sharing there and would be happy to take any questions.
Okay, so yeah, we have quite a few. And Kristen, keep monitoring while I'm sort of facilitating this portion. Thank you very much. So from Robin Mitchell, and this was apparently due to some brief problems with your audio in the beginning of your talk. She wants to once again know, what is the percentage of low and moderate intensity fires? And I don't know if that's historical or currently, but maybe you could address both.
Sure. Yeah, really good question. This is interesting. Historically, low and moderate severity fire, it was very, very commonly in that kind of 70 to 80% range, where high intensity fire would have been in that 20 to 30% range, sometimes more like 35%. Currently, it's actually pretty similar. High intensity fire may be a little bit higher than that, but the difference is that we have a lot less fire in most forests than we had historically. So that's the big distinction, is that we just have less fire in most of our forests, and that surprises a lot of people. We have too much fire in certain ecosystems, like Southern California chaparral, mostly just because it's close to the large population centers. There's a lot of people doing things that cause accidental ignitions. Climate change is a factor there too. But in our forests, we actually still have less. Part of that's because of fire suppression, the large part of that is. So the main thing is that the percentage of our forest that burns at high intensity is not out of bounds with historical levels. In fact, we still have less than we did historically. So for me, it means the way forward is to let more of those lightning strikes in more remote forests burn without trying to suppress them, because fire is doing important natural work. Including those high intensity fire patches, creating great habitat. They're naturally regenerating, storing a tremendous amount of carbon. And, in very little of the carbon is actually emitted in a forest by a large fire. And we could talk more about that too if people are interested. But bottom line is that we need to shift our focus to protecting communities instead of logging our forests.
Okay, great. And from Robert Rydell, is the frequency of high intensity fires trending lower or higher than the historical baseline of 25%? Sounds like you just answered that question, but
I did, but it's an important question, so I'll add a little bit to that. So fires have been getting more frequent on any given patch of ground. So overall fire activity has been increasing over the past 30 years, and I don't think that's any secret. Climate change is certainly a part of that. The key thing is, in fire, it's like everything. You don't want too much, you don't want too little. With fire in our forests, we still have less than we had historically. And that's actually a really bad thing because forests need fire. It's as important as sun and rain. It's critical for biodiversity. It's critical for nutrient cycling. It's critical for reproduction of the tree species. So we need the fire. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. Right now, we still have less than we did historically, but we do have more than we did 20 years ago. So the amount has increased, although it's still less than historical, but what has not increased is the percentage. That's not growing. So in other words, the high severity fire percentage is not increasing over time. And that's really good news, because what it means is we can have more fire, and it's actually having a kind of regulatory effect on the next fire that occurs.
Okay, thank you so much. And I have before we leave fire intensity, I do have a question in that regard. So I have heard narratives of there being like basically super high intensity fires that destroy trees and vegetation, but also render the soil incapable of supporting life, turning areas of forest land into basically moonscapes. Is this your experience?
I'm really glad you asked that question. Thank you. No, it's definitely not my experience. And this is really important. I do the research. First and foremost, I'm a field ecologist, and I have been for 2 decades now. I'm a boots on the ground guy, and I do this work, use satellite imagery too to augment my work, but I do it the hard way, for most of my work and most of the studies I publish. And I say that so you understand what I mean when I say that I have been focusing my research for 20 years in large, high-intensity fire patches. That's my specialty. This is what I do. And in 20 years, I have not found a single hectare of forest. Hectare is about 2.5 acres. I have not found a single hectare of forest that was burned at high intensity and is not naturally regenerating. There's lots of variability, which is good. We call it heterogeneity in ecological circles. Some areas regenerate more open, more pine oak regeneration with lots of shrubs. And the shrubs stick around longer, which is great because we love the shrubs. They're nitrogen fixers. They're flowering plants. They're great habitat for nesting birds and small mammals and wood warblers. They attract flying insects, which provide food for the fly-catching birds and bats. It's great habitat. Other areas regenerate really quickly and densely with conifers, oftentimes mostly fir cedar or mostly pine, and it's dense pine regeneration. And so there's lots of different ways that the regeneration happens. But what we do not see are moonscapes. We do not see areas where we have this concept that we hear oftentimes in the popular press that the area was nuked or it's a moonscape because of high intensity fire. This notion that the fire burns so hot that it sterilizes the soil and nothing will grow, that's a myth. It's literally mythology. And unfortunately, that myth has been spun and promoted by a lot of U.S. Forest Service scientists and university scientists who are funded by the U.S. Forest Service, often to the tune of $100,000 or $200,000 a year. And it's really important for people to understand. And this is why I take people out into the field every single year, many, many times, so they can see it for themselves. And we'll just spend a day going to these areas. You will not find an area at any significant time after fire. Like, yeah, you can go into a high intensity fire patch 1 year post fire, and it'll look pretty stark because it takes some time for all that plant life to regenerate. But you go in at 5, 6, 10 years post-fire, it's been completely transformed. So yeah, that notion of the moonscape, the area that are nuked by high intensity fire, That is absolute mythology. I would go so far as to call it government propaganda, because it's typically used to promote more post-fire logging and other types of logging. I'll tell you this, this has actually been studied. The downward projection of heat in a high intensity fire patch is 5 centimeters. 5 centimeters. Okay, that's about 2 inches. So the whole idea that it sterilizes the soil is absurd. It just doesn't work that way.
Glad to hear it. Another density data, another issue related to forest fire density, or no, forest density. How do you find historically accurate forest density data? A comment associated with that question is, I thought ponderosa pine forests were adapted to fire and were not that dense.
Yeah, good question. So ponderosa pine forests are adapted to fire. So are mixed conifer forests, where ponderosa pine is a component, but lots of other species are there. But just because forests are adapted to fire doesn't mean that they're not dense. In fact, oftentimes it means that they are very dense. Forests are adapted not just to fire, but they're adapted more specifically to mixed intensity fire. And that's really key to understand, because mixed intensity fire is oftentimes where you get your most vigorous regeneration in those moderate and high intensity fire patches. Maybe not in the first 3 or 4 years post-fire, but after that, it really starts picking up, and it can oftentimes dramatically eclipse what's happening in the low intensity fire areas. And this is particularly true for conifer species that have a special evolutionary adaptation to those moderate and high intensity fire patches, like giant sequoias, where they really don't reproduce effectively in low intensity fire patches. It's just basically just continues the profound and massive reproduction failure that we've seen during fire suppression due to the lack of fire.
Okay, great. And so there was a question about your reference, finding a list of your reference studies, and I'm assuming though they would primarily be found in your 2 books, The Myth of and
Yes.
Smokescreen. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yes. And in particular in Smokescreen, Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. That's more recent, and but if people are interested in an even more recent references, 2022 and 2023, they can feel free to reach out to me by email, and I'd be happy to send along some even more recent studies.
Okay. Awesome. So moving on from fire density and forest density and density related topics. Is cattle grazing also a factor in the post-fire forests you studied and photographed?
That's a great question. So cattle grazing is a problem after fires. Post-fire logging is a problem, but so is livestock grazing. Typically what we see is, and I wish I had this picture at my fingertips, put it up on the screen right now so you could all see it. I show people, these pictures of these devastated landscapes, these clear-cut landscapes where it's just bare soil and stumps, and all these cows are grazing in those areas. And people say, oh my gosh, isn't it terrible what's happening in Brazil, in the rainforest? And I say, that's not Brazil, that's the Stanislaus National Forest in the Sierra Nevada on public lands. And this was all done with taxpayer dollars. And people are horrified. They don't understand that that's the same exact kind of practices of forest clearing, subsidized deforestation, and then basically turning those areas over to livestock, because the livestock, they'll eat all the cheatgrass, those invasive grasses that are brought in by the logging machinery. And invasive grasses, they love unnaturally disturbed soil that's churned up by the logging machinery and the treads, and the cows eat that, and the ranchers are pretty happy with that arrangement, because they're subsidized too. So these are part of management practices that are really doing a lot of damage. I avoid these areas when I'm doing my research in terms of natural post-fire conifer regeneration. All the figures that I gave you are all areas that were not subjected to post-fire logging or planting, which is typically what occurs before they turn it over to livestock grazing. There are some exceptions, some areas that have not been post-fire logged where there are livestock, but it's very, very localized, and you can avoid them pretty easily.
Okay, do you have a comparison of biodiversity data as in the number of species in those post-fire areas that are logged and not logged?
Yeah, that's a great question. So basically, high intensity fire areas that are natural snag forest habitat and high intensity fire areas that are post-fire logged. Yeah, there's been a number of studies on this, and you can get a lot more information on this in my book Smokescreen. And just so everyone knows, I wrote Smokescreen for non-scientists to translate the science to non-scientists, but I have hundreds of scientific studies cited in the endnotes. So it's very well grounded in the science, but it's also accessible because I wrote it for non-scientists. And there's a lot of anecdotes in there and things like that to illustrate points. But one of the things I'd really talk about is this very subject of the high ecological value of natural post-fire habitat, especially snag forests created by high intensity fire, versus areas that are clear cut after fire, where basically, many of the species disappear. So you have far lower species abundance, far lower overall lower species richness, and lower overall wildlife abundance, because the post-fire logging removes two key things. It removes the snags, and when it removes the snags, it removes the potential for down logs as well. And it removes the shrubs, and as well as the natural post-fire conifer regeneration. So you don't have the habitat for the woodpeckers and the bluebirds and all the secondary cavity nesters. And you don't have the habitat on the forest floor from the shrubs for all those shrub nesting birds, for all those small mammals that use the shrubs for denning and the down logs. You don't have the flowering plants for the fly catching, for all the native insects, and therefore food for the fly catching birds and the bats. All that is basically gone, and it's essentially almost entirely, if not entirely, removed. And then of course, what they'll do is they'll spray herbicides to make sure they got rid of all of that vegetation, and then they plant tree plantations. And so you have this essentially a sterilized landscape that's not a forest; it's really just a tree farm. That's much more like a crop than anything else.
Okay, and I just want to say, having read Smokescreen a couple years ago myself, I can't stress enough how important a book it is. And for those of you who haven't read it, get on Amazon.com now, or no, after the talk anyway. Okay, so next question, how can we preserve California conifer and hardwood forests as net carbon sinks in the near term in order to achieve aggressive net zero emission targets?
Great question.
And a comment, a lot of areas are unique, each covering different important aspects of forests.
Yeah, this is a great question. So, this is one of those studies that is not in Smokescreen because we published it after Smokescreen was released. My colleagues and I published this study in last year, 2022, and Dominic De La Sala and Mark Harmon, we all worked together. We did 4.5 years of intensive field research in two of the largest fires that have occurred in recent decades in the Sierra Nevada, the Rim Fire of 2013 and the Creek Fire of 2020. And we looked at a very specific question, which was, what percentage of the tree biomass is actually consumed in these big fires? And what we found is, on average, it's 1.2%. 1.2%. That's it. So less than 2% of the tree biomass is consumed. Now, of course, a lot of these trees, most of them are not killed by the fire, but they're scorched. And then even the ones that are killed, the fire only consumes the outer surface of the bark. It can consume the pine needles and the smallest twigs, but the vast majority of the carbon is still there. And not only that, the fire cycles nutrients and stimulates new growth and carbon sequestration. And I mention this because it's such an important question, and I thank you for asking it, because what we're finding is that we compared our results to these theoretical modeling studies that have been produced by the U.S. Forest Service for years, where they assumed that 50%, and in some cases 80% of the tree biomass is consumed in these fires. And they said, well, look, if we do these commercial thinning operations where we're removing 30 or 40% of the biomass, gosh, that's a lot less than 50 or 80%. So therefore, commercial thinning must be a really good idea. And but this wasn't based on field data. It was just based on stuff that was made up. I mean, it was just theoretical modeling. They never bothered to validate their assumptions. So what we found is that it wasn't 50 or 80%, it was 1% of the tree biomass consumed. And that 1% that actually is consumed and emitted, that very tiny percentage, is very quickly made up by all the post-fire regrowth, where that CO2 is pulled back into the forest from the atmosphere. And so this is really important to understand, because once you understand what's really going on in terms of the carbon flux from a climate change standpoint in these forests, based on actual real field data gathered the hard way, that you realize that that these forests are enormous carbon sinks, even when you do have big fires. And in fact, the fires in many ways facilitate the carbon sink status by cycling nutrients and spurring and enhancing new growth. And so the thing that's emitting so much carbon from our forests is not forest fires, because in the media, they're always using these theoretical figures and they never talk about the carbon uptake from the regrowth. What's really the big carbon bomb, and I talk about this extensively in my book, Smokescreen, the big carbon bomb is logging, both post-fire logging, clear cutting, and also commercial thinning. Just to put in perspective, commercial thinning, based on the most recent research, and if folks want to reach out, I can send you the most recent studies on this. A lot of them are from 2022. Commercial thinning emits 3 times more CO2 per acre than wildfire alone. So it's a massive carbon emitter relative to fire, which, in fire, you always get a very, a temporary pulse of CO2, of course, because you also have duff and litter on the forest floor that gets consumed. But that carbon that's emitted is very quickly, rapidly reabsorbed by the forest if it's not logged after fire.
Okay, I wonder, can you just briefly comment in terms of any fuel reduction, vegetation management, forest restoration, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah.
What types of these kinds of projects do you support?
Well, I support process restoration. Process restoration is natural processes with which these forests evolved, like wildfire, like cycles of native bark beetles, and these are native species. Excuse me. I support that because it creates habitat, as opposed to logging, which I do not support, because it removes carbon and removes habitat. And so, fire can kill trees, and so does logging. Logging kills trees too, including thinning. The difference is when fire or beetles kill a tree, you have a snag. You have the carbon that's still there. You have this amazing wildlife habitat that's been created, because a dead tree has even more wildlife potential than a live tree. Whereas when logging occurs, you have a stump, which contributes nothing.
Okay, thank you. What trees should be planted in California oak, park woodlands or California hillsides? That's one question from the same person. Is the Sierra Club or any other organization helping with replanting of riverbanks and hillsides where dams will be removed between California and Oregon? And again, I'm going to group all these from the same person. Can we help by growing plants or seedlings in California if we have farmland to grow trees and plants for replanting projects?
Yeah, so there are places where you might need to plant in certain circumstances if it's been a long time since the native vegetation was cleared away and there isn't any native vegetation anywhere nearby, usually by agriculture or other human development. But the reality is you really don't need to plant. You don't need to plant trees. Trees naturally regrow, and it's always best to have that natural native seed stock that is basically has thousands and thousands of years of evolution on that microsite, adapted to that microsite. Naturally regenerate in those areas. And if it's simply not happening, of course, you can have that conversation about planting. But I will say this, The whole conversation about reforestation and planting is driven by the assumption that forests don't regenerate after fire or after cycles of native beetles and mortality from beetles and during droughts. And that's not true. Forests do regenerate. They regenerate incredibly well. And so what we typically see is planting operations in almost every case. You can find exceptions, but they're very, very rare. In almost every case, planting operations, or as they often call them, reforestation operations, are typically and almost always inextricably linked to clear cutting, either clear cutting before a fire or clear cutting after a fire. But basically, planting is very heavily associated with clear cut logging. And so I always mention that to folks because there's people like the idea of planting trees because we think it's a benign activity, and we don't realize that it's almost always basically just the other side of the coin with clear cut. You clear cut the forest and then you plant the trees, and that forests don't really need to be planted after fires.
Okay, so you mentioned a little bit of the use of herbicides on land after post-fire logging. The question was, it basically, is there use of herbicides on land after post-fire logging? And so I guess after salvage logging, is it the same as clear cutting live trees in terms of? Yeah,
it is. When the U.S. Forest Service does post-fire logging operations, that again, they do euphemistically under the guise of post-fire restoration and reforestation, and oftentimes they'll throw in the term fuel reduction, which is another logging euphemism. What they do is they clear cut these these carbon-rich and ecologically rich snag forest habitats. They clear cut them. Then they go in with herbicides and they spray them heavily, and then they plant tree plantations, again, most of which die. When they spray the herbicides, and this is the common practice, I mean, again, if you look hard enough, you can find an exception where they clear cut and they plant, but they don't spray herbicides. But again, that's the exception to the rule. Typically, they're spraying herbicides, and what they use is glyphosate. Glyphosate is toxic, it's carcinogenic. And if you go into these areas after they spray, you'll see all these signs that say danger, poison, this is on our national forest. This is being done with taxpayer dollars. And the spraying is massive. I mean, it's a very, very intensive operation. It's getting into the water. The industry will say, well, glyphosate will break down over a certain period of time. Well, that's true, but it's a much longer time than the industry, the chemical manufacturers would like us to know about. And oftentimes the rains come and wash those chemicals into the streams long before they break down. So this is really, one of those things that just has to be ended. But it's a typical practice in post-fire logging.
Okay, you I appreciate that all your answers are so thoughtful. So moving on, you can comment on just the after effects of the effects, should I say, of drought on forest reiteration. Maybe that meant regeneration over time.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did my first study, but one of my more recent studies on post-fire conifer regeneration, which was Hanson 2018, and then the more recent study with Tanya Chi, which is Hanson and Chi 2021. We gathered those data on trees that regenerated naturally after fire during pretty severe drought conditions. So, in Hanson and Chi 2021, we gathered those data in 2018 in a fire that burned in 2013. And we gathered them in the lower elevation forests. And we found incredible vigorous natural conifer regeneration. So if it wasn't a severe drought, certainly there would have been even more conifer regeneration. But what's really interesting, and what frankly I find very hopeful, is the fact that even during severe drought conditions, the conifer regeneration was quite remarkable.
Okay, so are there restoration replanting practices that do work in logged areas and the seedling and where, I'm sorry, we have those areas that have been logged and the seedlings planted have failed? Are there restoration replanting practices that do work there? if left alone, what happens there?
Right. That's a good question. So there's two questions there, and I'll try to answer both. So if you leave the areas alone that burn at high intensity, yes, they will naturally regenerate. So you don't need to intervene. If these areas are logged and replanted, oftentimes most of the trees will die. Sometimes most of them survive of the planted trees. So it is a mix. But the places where most of them die, that's very common. And in some cases, the great majority of the trees they plant die. In many cases, the post-fire logging does so much damage that they will go in and spray the herbicides, and then they'll plant, and almost everything they plant dies. They'll come in a couple years later, they'll spray herbicides a second time and plant a second time, and that dies. And then they'll come in a third time and spray herbicides and plant again. I know of a number of cases where they're already in the third round of this. And I'm encouraging them just to kind of take that as an object lesson and stop doing that, and recognize that right next door in the same high intensity fire patch where there was no logging, there's, the trees are at that point in time naturally regenerating 200-300 per acre, and they're 12 feet tall.
Okay, and this is a subject that could be a topic for a whole nother hour, but can you just kind of summarize a little bit? Does your research have guidance for protecting homes in the WUI?
Yeah. So I in fact, this is such an important topic that I devoted an entire chapter in my book Smokescreen to what we need to do to protect homes from wildfires, what we need to do to protect communities. And I contrast that to real world examples and real world data on what happens if we do it the wrong way, which is basically what we're doing right now. So this is a large topic, and it really deserves its own conversation, but I'll just say this briefly, that wildfires are driven mostly by weather and climate factors, hot, dry, windy conditions. That's what the research shows. That's what my own research shows, and lots of other groups of scientists. It is climate, it is weather. If you have an ignition, you have those hot, dry, windy days, the fire is going to move. And these fires are blowing through thousands and thousands of acres where the Forest Service or private logging companies have done these, logging operations under euphemisms like thinning, like fuel reduction or fuel breaks, post-fire logging under the guise of fuel breaks. And it's burning very rapidly. The fires are burning very rapidly through those logged areas, oftentimes faster and more intensely. And there's stacks of scientific studies showing that. And then it's reaching the town, oftentimes faster than it otherwise would have. And so these logging operations out in the wildlands are putting communities at greater risk for three reasons. Number one, oftentimes the fires move more quickly through the thinned areas than through a dense forest, because thinned areas have an altered microclimate. When they remove so many of the trees, they remove much of the cooling shade of the forest canopy. So they create hotter, drier, and windier conditions. They remove the windbreak effect of a denser forest, and the winds sweep through faster, and they reach the town faster. And the research is showing that fires move faster through those thin forests. And that means they reach a town more quickly. People have less time to evacuate. So that's number one. Number two, it's diverting scarce resources away from the things that actually protect communities, like home hardening, like defensible space pruning within 100 feet of homes, like evacuation assistance, like community fire safe shelters. All of these are critical measures that are proven to be highly effective in saving homes and saving lives during a wildfire. When they do these logging projects out in the backcountry, and they call them fuel breaks, they're diverting scarce resources away from those things. Right now, the vast majority of the wildfire money is going into those backcountry logging projects and not into home hardening or defensible space or evacuation assistance. Number three, when they're doing things the way they do it right now, which is using most of the money for backcountry logging and calling it fuel reduction and fuel breaks, it gives communities a false sense of security. People think, well, hey, the U.S. Forest Service and CAL FIRE and the local logging company just told me that this logging project out there over the ridge in the national forest, that's going to stop the fire. It's going to be a fuel break, and the fire won't reach the town. So why should I spend $700 on defensible space and hiring someone, if I can't do it myself, to clean the dry pine needles out of my rain gutters or sweep the dry oak leaves and pine needles off my roof? Why should I do that if Forest Service says they've got me covered? And that false sense of security is causing towns to burn. It's getting people killed. And so we from a community safety standpoint, we really have to just change course.
Great, and maybe we'll invite you back for a whole hour on this topic.
All right.
So is there any data from where there has been a lot of die-off from bark beetles on what happens in logged versus unlogged forests, and basically kind of asking, could the dying forest result mainly from logging and forest management practices?
Good question. So there was some really good research. There's been some really good research done by Diana Six in the Northern Rockies, but she's done research across the West on this issue. About basically killing a bunch of trees and saying it's going to reduce forest density and it's going to make them more resilient. And therefore, overall, you kill some trees, but it's going to save a lot more trees. So that's the narrative that we're being fed by the logging industry, by the U.S. Forest Service. And she presents a very compelling argument in her 2014 paper with her colleagues that that's actually not borne out by the data. In fact, what happens is just like commercial thinning ostensibly as fuel reduction to curb wildfires, what we see is that it's killing far more trees than it prevents from being killed, whether you're talking about fire or bark beetles. The other thing that we've looked at is, do these areas that have more dead trees naturally from cycles of drought and these native bark beetle species, do the forests that have relatively more dead trees burn relatively more intensely when the next wildfire occurs? And the overwhelming majority of the research finds the answer is no, including my own research. I looked at this in my 2021 study on the Creek Fire. And what we do find is that, interestingly, and maybe somewhat counterintuitively for some folks, is that places where the Forest Service has removed dead trees through these salvage logging operations, either after fire or drought, those areas do tend to burn more severely when fires occur. And so the conclusion that I draw from that is that the snags are really not a significant driver of fire behavior. And in fact, they might even be a factor in modulating and moderating fire behavior to some extent, largely because when snags fall, they become large down logs. And a lot of people assume that that's fuel. Well, of course, they can get partially consumed in a fire, mostly by smoldering combustion after the flames have passed. But what people forget is those large down logs are also giant sponges. They can soak up and retain 25 times more water per cubic foot than the surrounding soil. So they really operate in ways that are very, very different from what we assume.
Okay. Can you comment at all on the fight against logging in Jackson Demonstration Forest in Mendocino? And related to that, are the redwood forests in Northern California different enough from, like the redwood, how do the redwood forests, should I say, differ from the Southern Sierra where you do most of your work?
Yeah, great question. They're very similar. I mean, redwood forests are adapted to mixed intensity fire, very similar, to the forests of the Sierra Nevada. The fire regimes are not identical, but they're broadly similar. Redwood forests have natural evolutionary adaptations to high intensity fire in particular. If a high intensity fire patch occurs, there is almost no mortality of mature coast redwoods. Even if they're completely charred all the way up, even if all the vegetation, all the foliage is consumed, it looks like a dead tree. And oftentimes they're cut down. People assume they're dead and they cut them down. The next year after the fire, they will epicormically branch. They will produce new green branches from the trunks, from the branches. They will recreate their crown structure. And it's just remarkable to watch. It's just a marvel of evolution, going back, 10 million, tens of millions of years in evolutionary history, these adaptations. And so they clearly have a long evolutionary history with fire in general, but also high intensity fire patches. And as far as the campaign to protect Jackson State Forest, to me, it's been an inspiration. I went out there and met with the activist folks, biodiversity activists and indigenous, Native American tribes joining together to protect this state forest from the logging industry, and against the ravages of logging being perpetrated by CAL FIRE. And to me, it's just been a real inspiration to watch them work and the multifaceted way that they've approached their work. They've got civil disobedience, they've got public education, they're bringing in scientists, they're going to court. Yeah, I'm all for it, and I think Jackson State Forest should be protected from logging entirely. There should not be any. It should basically, logging should be banned on the state forest.
Okay, it's a little past 5, and so but we have like a whole bunch of messages or questions that just start kind of keep rolling in, where we obviously don't want to stay here till 2 o'clock in the morning. So just kind of checking in with you, Chad, Karen, how much longer do you think we should go?
For my part, I'm perfectly happy to go another 15 minutes if that's all right. If that's cool with you all.
Jennifer, let me invite a couple people to have questions or comments, because some of them are very long in chat, and I'm thinking one is Dan Courtney. Maybe he works a lot on PG&E. Maybe he might want to say something.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, but the comment that went along with his question was quite lengthy and detailed and enlightening. And so do you want him to just comment directly then and ask?
I think that would probably be better. So Dan, do you want to unmute yourself and make your comment, sure, your question?
Yeah, I'll try. So basically, so first of all, Chad, I have property, 14 acres, in just 5 miles outside Yosemite National Park, which was burned through the rim fire. The surrounding property is private property. It's about 120 acres total. So on my property, I left everything the way it was, didn't take down any of the burnt trees or anything. I've got now new growth, instant cedar, ponderosa pine, black oak, Douglas fir, and sugar pine all over the place, like 6 feet high, 10 feet high. Really great. My neighbors who logged have some coming back, not as much. And then all around us, we're surrounded by Stanislaus National Forest, and some areas they logged, other areas mostly they didn't. The dead trees are still standing. It's almost 10 years later now, nine and a half years. They haven't fallen for the most part. And so we have a variety of situations going on there. But so that's the background. My question is, the deal now is we have issues with PG&E that keep coming through on, they're hell-bent to take down all the tall trees on either side of the power lines that they call overstrike trees, like with their enhanced vegetation management program. And they're doing that, twice a year. They come through, and 20 trees this time, 30 trees next time. All in all, 14 acres now, I've lost like 300 trees to them. And what's happening is the remaining trees that aren't as tall are within a year or two, they're breaking mid-height and they're falling over. We've noticed, we have higher winds. We have a ridge on the west side. The wind comes up, and I believe it's being funneled through this tunnel, which is getting ever and ever wider, because the trees they haven't cut are, they were not shielded from the wind as they were growing up, so they're not reflexive, and they're snapping. I just wonder if what do you think of this practice? Because in my opinion, it looks like it's making us more vulnerable to a high-speed winds, which would be propelling the flaming brands and so forth. And it's also, we're getting, different growth now. We're having more drier stuff. So we have a lot of dry brush coming up.
Yep.
Wonder if you think this is productive or counterproductive with regards to reducing wildfire risk.
Yeah, yeah, really good question. First of all, I'm really sorry to hear you're going through that. I'm not a big fan of PG&E. A lot of people are reporting very similar things about PG&E in their neck of the woods. So I'm sorry to hear you're going through that. Hang in there. But to answer your question, yeah, this is not helping you in terms of wildfire. So for two reasons, and you identified both of them, very correctly. The logging that they're doing is removing the windbreak effect that the forests have. Forests buffer the winds. That's what they do. And so they forests buffer the winds for adjacent trees, and they buffer the winds in terms of wildfire spread, because fires are driven by winds, and the denser stands cut down on those winds. So when they're removing a lot of trees, they're removing that windbreak effect, number one. Number two, when they're doing those logging operations, they are exposing the forest floor to more sunlight. And they're bringing in the seeds, these tiny little seeds of invasive grasses on the treads of the logging machinery. And it's impossible to get those. They say, well, we try to wash them off, but that's irrelevant. I mean, it's impossible to get those little seeds out of the treads of the tractors that they use for logging. And so they're always going to bring it in, and you're always going to get those invasive grasses after logging occurs. And those invasive grasses are highly combustible, and they spread flames very, very quickly and rapidly, and they ignite very easily. So no, they're not doing you any favors there. I mean, best thing you can do is, for whatever structure you have on the property, just do your best to harden the home and the structure, and do the defensible space pruning within, the first 60 feet around the house is most important. But in terms of the rest of your property, yeah, they're not doing you any favors.
Thank you. That's what I thought.
Yeah, but sorry to hear that. By the way, I think what you're describing there is just a really cool natural laboratory, and I would love to come out and see it sometime. If you want to take a walk in the woods. I'm in that area a lot doing research.
Definitely, you're invited. Let's do that.
All right.
Can I come too?
You can all come. I mean, I want to see it. I want everybody to see what's going on out here. It's the same as Yosemite National Park, except we have a little patch of private property ownership. It's like an old homestead from a sawmill. So we have federal land all around us, and then private property where different owners are doing different things. And the rim fire burned right through us, and it's been coming up on 10 years now. So we see results.
Yeah, it'd be really cool to see that juxtaposition of where you let it be and let it naturally regenerate, and the spots adjacent on national forests where they let it be versus the spots on the national forest where they clear cut it, and then your adjacent private neighbors where they post fire logged too. What you're describing is very, very similar to what I'm seeing over and over and over again in the rim fire, in those same juxtapositions. The post fire logging, it's basically just undermining the succession of the forest. It's setting everything back.
So Wendy, why don't you ask the last question?
Hi, Chad. Well, I just want to say that this is so fantastic, but I don't live in a forest area. I live in Chaparral. I live in the Santa Monica Mountains, and a lot of what you're saying really resonates for how these areas mimic what you're talking about. But I just thought maybe you could talk a little bit about the Chaparral area and parallels or differences.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, so the lessons are very, very similar in Chaparral and forests. Fire is natural. You can have too much, you can have too little. The main difference is in Chaparral, we have too much fire, almost overwhelmingly because of human ignitions. Because again, these Chaparral ecosystems are adjacent to very, very significant population centers where there's people doing things in summer that cause accidental ignitions. Sometimes it's arson, but usually it's just accidents. And so, if that happens on a hot, dry, windy day, you're going to get fire. So we have too much fire in Chaparral, and that's an ecological concern. It really is. Some of my colleagues have written extensively about this, Rick Halsey and Bryant Baker in particular. In forests, we have less fire than we did naturally historically before fire suppression. So it's the opposite. But in terms of the biodiversity, in terms of the relationship, it's very similar. Fire is natural, including high intensity fire in both ecosystems. Chaparral burns almost exclusively at high intensity fire. I could say exclusively, but I've seen some small areas that were more like low and moderate severity, even in mature manzanita, but that's very rare. It basically burns at high intensity, and a lot of the chaparral species are very strongly evolved to depend on intense fire to reproduce effectively. But the main thing is you just don't want too much or too little. Right now in chaparral, we have too much. But same lessons apply in terms of community protection too. Defensible space, home hardening, going out 60 feet, at most 100. And it's not about cutting down mature trees or anything like that, or mature manzanita. It's about, dry grasses and seedlings and saplings and understory stuff. It's really about, that. It's about pruning. It's not about clear cutting. And then, of course, home hardening. Those same principles apply to chaparral as ecosystems as they do to forests. And so bottom line is, whether it's chaparral or forest, we need to stop managing the wildlands and stop pulling carbon out of the wildlands, because chaparral is being clear cut too extensively in Southern California. And sometimes masticated, sometimes it's being chipped and taken to the biomass plants, just like they're doing to forests. And that's not doing anyone any favors. It's making climate change worse, and it's just basically spreading cheatgrass, and the fires are going to move faster through those areas right to the towns and the homes. So, we just need to do a 180, honestly, on our current management practices in both chaparral country and in the forest.
Okay, well, I think this brings us to a close here. And thank you so much for coming and talking to us, Chad. It's been very, very enlightening. And hopefully, as Jennifer said, you would be willing to come back again sometime. So.
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks to everyone for your interest and for staying for the Q&A. It's been a great discussion. I'm happy to do it anytime. And again, I hope to see some of you in the field. It's something I really enjoy doing, and people typically learn a lot.
And I just want to say, you probably haven't been able to pay too much attention to the chat, but there are all kinds of comments singing your praises. And I think we can all agree that we've been in the presence of a pretty cool, brilliant guy for the last hour or so.
Well, that is incredibly sweet. And thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate that. You made my day.
I'm sorry we didn't get along. We didn't get to all the questions and some of the very awesome comments. And please reach out to Chad if you really would like your question addressed. He's happy to follow up with you on that, and also if you want to pass along the comments you made to him.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye.